Hi there. Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth McManus, and I'm the head of leading transformation and engagement for the Oxford Group. So it's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon in this conversation about leading in a digital age and what it might mean for your leadership in your organisation. And with me is my colleague, Katrina Hewitson. Katrina.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Katrina Hewitson. I'm a senior consultant at the Oxford Group. I work across strategy and leadership and team development. And one of my areas of real focus in the last 12 months has been understanding the implications for leading in a digital age.
So yeah, the agenda today really is to give you the opportunity to think about how the challenges that your organisation is facing and how leadership challenges might be playing out in this disruptive and digital environment. So there are a couple of things I wanted to say about that context. One is we know that the digital age and the implications of digital are actually a subset of a much wider and more complex process of change. So a disruptive environment is the context in which we're all living and working, and digital is very much a subset of that. And so I think where we would want to start really is to say that this disruptive environment is very much about three things. It's very much about the environment in which your organization is operating. It's very much about the people and what makes a difference to the way people operate in that environment. And leadership is very much part of that. And I think thirdly, it's about technology and about the differences technology is making to the way that we work and to how we feel as humans in the workplace. So we have a really interesting quote, which I meant a lot to me, I guess. And it said that the digital age is very much about the people, not only about the tech. So in this conversation, what we would love to invite you to do is think about where your organization is in terms of disruption and change, both in terms of the digital landscape, but also very much in terms of the leadership landscape and what that means for leadership in your organization.
We'd really much, as Elizabeth said, we'd really like this to be a conversation. So we'd welcome any questions and any comments as we go through. You'll have seen that on the right hand of your screen, you have a chat box. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat box and picking up questions and comments throughout. We're going to run 3 polls during the course of the conversation, just to check in with how you think your organization is and how you are around some of the subject matter. And we'll make some time at the end to pick up specifically on any outstanding questions that people have. Okay, so first poll, personal question actually. The digital age has changed the way I lead, either profoundly, number 1, up to a point, number 2, or I'm not sure yet, number 3. So I wonder if you would vote and give us your view on that. Wow. That's incredible.
That's an interesting finding. Wow.
Okay. Oh no. All right. Okay. So slightly more ambiguous than it first looked. Okay. But for the majority of people that we're speaking to, there's already been some profound change. So we're going to talk about what those changes have looked like in our experience. But please do share any experiences that you've got, either in the form of questions or in the form of comments. And interestingly, nobody has said, "I'm not sure yet." Actually, that's uncommon. So we are certainly working with organizations whose biggest dilemma actually is uncertainty about how they're going to respond. And I think that's been quite tricky for a number of organizations, because they're feeling perhaps overwhelmed by their current reality and not even able to look at what's happening in the future. Let's have a look at the context as we understand it. Elizabeth, I think I'm handing back to you for this part.
Thank you. So, thanks very much for responding. And we noticed that almost 70% of people who've responded in the chat actually have been profoundly affected in terms of how they lead by the level of change in this particular digital environment. So I'm just going to say a wee bit about the context, I guess, and maybe share some things about what we're seeing in client organizations and in the wider economic landscape and the factors that are affecting organizations at the moment. So what you'll see on screen is a whole series of 6 characteristics that go right the way across organizations in this digital environment. So whichever sector you're in, you're probably already affected by or about to be affected by one of these 6 things. The enormous rise in use of big data, with the implications that has for operating models, for operating environments, for privacy and security, for safety, for customer expectations. The ability to produce and bring to market new and different products. The use of artificial intelligence with all the implications that presents, including questions that we don't know the answer to. So lots of the questions that organizations are facing now around AI are because we know it exists, we know what it's done so far, but we actually don't know what it's capable of. And so how do we recruit? How do we skill? How do we develop people for a world where we actually don't know what the shape of that world is going to be? What conditions do leaders need to create to lead in that world where there are so many unknowns? We know that there are many disruptions to business models. The rise of unexpected competition, the rise of platform companies, the rise of very rapid escalations in customer expectations. So what customers expect, how and when they expect it. And the possibility to work, to live and to learn anywhere, anytime, on any device. So in the audience today, in the room today, we've got people from a range of different perspectives, HR, L&D, other technical specialists and colleagues. So whatever field of work you're in, you and your community and your stakeholders are very likely to be affected by all of these. And so we'd like to really be inviting you to think about, what do these specific things mean? What are you doing as a result of these things? And what does it mean for how you operate as an individual? What does it mean for how you lead the teams and the organizations that you're leading? So let's have a look at the wider context. If those 6 things are the 6 variables that are affecting our landscape in organizations, what do they actually mean for the context? What else is happening around those things? And again, we'd like to really draw attention and share some thinking on these 6 things. And we'd like to invite you to comment on these as we're going along. So in the chat box, I'd love to hear what you think, what you're thinking and what's happening for you. And I can see a couple of people beginning to think about stuff right now. The level of change is huge. That goes without saying. It's exponential. We know that in the last number of years, deference has gone down. And what we mean by that is customers, employees, stakeholders, the market being less and less ready to accept experts and expertise. So people pushing, changing, disrupting, breaking, striving to do things very differently. And with that comes the death of most, if not all, of the traditional ways of thinking about organizations. And that's already happened. So that's not new. I think what is new, though, is the extent to which leaders are having to ask themselves the question, how do I lead in that context? And as Katrina said, that's what a huge amount of our curiosity is really around this year. And a huge amount of our research and thinking is around that. We know that there is less and less confidence and more uncertainty in the marketplace. We know that differences in generations coming into the workplace has made a huge difference. And actually, we're in a unique position at the moment because we've got organizations led by people, in many cases, who are from a different mindset, from a different way of thinking, either from a different generation or certainly from a different landscape, leading people who've got an entirely different vision of what organizations are about. So the whole question, what's an organization? How is it led? That's really being taken out for a run at the moment and really being challenged, along with much bigger social trends, globalization, the rise of populism, as Katrina mentioned earlier on. So all of this presents opportunities, and it presents adventures and excitement and a huge amount of investigation of uncertainty. So a lot of the research that we've been involved with in the last couple of years has been about asking the question, what does that mean for you, for your organizations? And what we're seeing is, if you have a look at these statistics, actually we're seeing that in that latest piece of research that we've been involved with within City and Guilds Group, more than 1,000 people responding, 60% of people, of workers, say that leaders and individuals don't necessarily have the skills to tackle digital transformation. So there's a need to learn a lot of things about the digital world in itself. But look at what's happening in the middle box at the bottom. So what we're saying is 94% of leaders, 94% of respondents, believe that leaders need to set an example, not only when it comes to new technologies, but actually when it comes to ways of working. And for us, that isn't just technology, it's mindset, it's creating the climate for innovation, it's being a role model for dealing with uncertainty. And it's the need for leaders to think about what they do when they don't know what to do. So in your organization, what is the new operating environment going to be within which you're working? What does that mean for how you need to lead? And actually, people are excited about the possibilities of that. At the same time, there's a certain measure of fear and concern. So what we'd like to stimulate your thinking on is, how do you lead in an environment where these things are happening? Not only how do you lead using digital technologies or thinking about digital environments, but as a human being, how do you operate in a way that makes people safe and adventurous in these high change environments? Katrina, I know that's something you're passionate about and have given a lot of thought to.
Yes, so one of the things that was fascinating for me in my work this year was to recognize how emotionally ambiguous people were feeling at a time when it feels as though very much is possible, where you need people to be willing to experiment, where you need people to be comfortable with times of sustained uncertainty. You need people to be comfortable because you may not be able to pin down an absolutely precise strategy in terms of what's going to happen, or tell them that their job isn't going to disappear through AI, or assure them that their privacy is safe and that the data that the organization holds is absolutely neutral and it's being treated with respect. So what was interesting in this research was not just the bigger context that was emerging, I think, that we all live in, but to understand what that was doing to the psychological safety of people at a time when you might want them to feel very safe and therefore very willing to take on some of the challenges that are involved. So the research gave us a couple of insights. One is that it's more difficult to manage the psychological safety of employees at organizations, and that could be for a whole variety of reasons. So it could be because people are feeling less safe outside the organization for some of the reasons that we've talked at: concern about climate change, concern about the political environment, or it could be because people are feeling less safe within their own organization because they're uncertain about what their job looks like in the future. They're uncertain about the way that their organization is heading. And in terms of one of the things that we want to talk about a little bit later, they may have some ethical questions about the kind of decisions that the organization is making or might make. And what's interesting is that, again, people are looking to leaders to help them in this respect. So there's an expectation that leaders can help, leaders should somehow know what to do, at a time when perhaps leaders are feeling that they don't necessarily have the answers. So we're seeing leaders who are not expert, we're seeing leaders who can't say with certainty what's going to happen, and so leaders, therefore, who are challenged with a hugely complex environment to operate in and make decisions around, but also with people who may be emotionally really needing a different kind of support and a very human level of support. And of course, all of this could be happening at a time when you're not in the same room with your team on a day-to-day basis. So in the previous times I've worked with a team, I worked with a team around 15 years ago who were desks were all next to each other, and they'd been through a crisis and they felt that they'd lost their human contact. Everybody was head down, very, very focused on their day-to-day work, and they sort of lost the desire to say hello and goodbye to each other, even though simple forms of human contact. And one of the ways that they solved that was that they eventually got somebody to host, they took it in turns, so somebody would host a coffee morning at their desk once a week, and they all started talking to each other again. Of course, if your team's spread across the world, if your team's in different time zones, if your regular team contact is in a format like this webinar is, that human contact and bringing that in becomes more challenging, and I think probably more essential. So
I guess that also raises for me a question I guess I wanted to ask you in a way, Katrina, which is, from your experience in recent times, what sort of challenges are leaders facing as the pace of change goes up and the implications of the digital age unfold? Is it very much around these issues of safety, or are there other issues that come up for you?
So I think there's absolutely an issue of safety and of humanity. I think we've been talking about authenticity in leadership for quite a long while, people wanting to know who their leaders are. And I think that links to what we were talking about earlier around the death of deference, that people will not automatically accord respect or authority to their leader until they know something about who they are and what they're going to do. So I think absolutely there's some of those psychological safety aspects. We've talked about how complex it can be to make strategy in an age like this one. We've talked about some of the personal challenges that leaders can face, and that includes not feeling as though you're the expert anymore. There's the challenge of leadership identity. But I also think, and we touched on this earlier, and I'll just come on to it in the next slide, because there's, again, some interesting research around this. There are new questions of ethics that emerge that people are beginning to ask in the digital age. And again, there's an expectation that leaders will perhaps take a view, take a perspective on this. So on one level, this isn't new. We've often seen organizations talk about their values. We've seen organizations talk about purpose. I was at PwC recently, and they have a head of purpose who is a highly influential individual in that organization. But the whole set of questions around ethics, so this research was really interesting. It's from an organization called Dot Everyone, and it's actually amongst tech workers who themselves, even though they're driving much of the change and the invention and the creativity, many of them would think that it has benefited society and can continue to benefit society. Big positive impacts like healthcare or climate change, but I think also small adjustments like the convenience of being able to do certain things online. But they've also seen decisions made that they have ethical concerns around. And when you look at that, it could be to do with questions of addictiveness around technology. It could be privacy and data, which is really significant. It could be concerns around unemployment, which we see through the development of AI and new products and new platforms. But also in an age where we're probably in an environment where we're encouraging everybody to perhaps take more risk and try and experiment, people in the tech industry who've been doing that for some time and are maybe ahead of many of us are also saying that there's some risks inherent in that, and they're concerned about sometimes products emerging without the implications being fully understood. So I think there's some really ethical questions, and for me, if leaders aren't having those conversations with their teams, then those conversations are going to occur without the leaders being present, and those will be difficult conversations to be outside, I think.
So I guess just before we move on, I just wanted to invite people in the chat box. I can see those people, a few people have already got their familiarization with the chat box going. I'd love to know in the chat box, from your perspective in your organization right now, how far are you facing issues either of safety or ethics that come from either the use of data, the digital landscape, or just the rate of change in the organization? So as we're thinking about this, please just put in the chat box what's going on for you in your organization right now. Are you facing ethical dilemmas? Are you facing dilemmas of creating conditions for people to feel safe enough to deal with a level of change? Is your market changing in such a way that actually it's presenting new and different questions for your organization? And we'll keep an eye on the chat box. So as and when people put views in, we'll share comments back. If you want it to be private, then just put that in the chat box as well. So just while we're letting people do that, I guess I wanted to comment on just a couple of other things from what Katrina was saying. And one of them is the fact that some of the pressures and interesting opportunities that leaders are facing at the moment, they go right to the central question of what's the identity of your organization and what kind of leadership is necessary to represent that identity. One of the particular challenges that we know organizations are facing at the moment is that their market and their identity is changing faster in many cases than their leadership behaviors can change. So you have a series of situations where the market's evolving, customer expectations are evolving, the brand is evolving, the uncertainty is evolving, and there's a need to try and get your leadership community focused on that and quickly addressing the question, how do we need to lead in order to represent that new organization or that new brand or that new way of working? And so, again, it would be interesting to know for you in your organizations, is there a time lag between what the organization needs to do, how it needs to adapt to its environment, and the speed with which the leadership community can catch up with that? How is that happening for you? So again, we're interested to know what your views are there. You'll see on the screen at the moment, just while you're having a think about that, a couple of recommendations. In the last couple of years, we've been working to produce some thinking and some work and research on what leadership and learning looks like in a digital environment, in a digital age. And one of the things that we know, and I mentioned it earlier on, is that one of the characteristics of successful organizations in a digital environment and a digital age is the ability to create a constant learning environment. And that's not only the ability to create an environment where people can learn and want to learn, but the ability to accelerate learning. So for those of you on the conversation today who are learning specialists, you will be in this world very much already. The need for learning to be just in time, to be very agile, to be very responsive, to be not only obviously blended and interesting, but actually to be very learner-centric, to be very learner-led, and to be very, very responsive to the needs of the organization and to the needs of that individual, to have a very high social learning component to it, and to feel very much closer to a customer experience. Allied to that, leaders need to be creating an environment where they're role modeling learning in a continuously uncertain environment. So those on the call who are L&D specialists, we kind of get that, and we know very much that is what's happening in that environment, and this research is very much around that. So at the end of the webinar, we're going to put a link up for you. If you're interested and would like to know more about that research paper, then it would be lovely to share a copy with you and to have your thoughts back on that. I also want to give a shout out for a new book. You'll see on the slide that De facto Ed is mentioned there. And Professor Alan Brown, who is one of the specialist partners in De facto Ed, has recently published a book which we would heartily recommend, and it's called Delivering Digital Transformation. Alan is a passionate believer that the way digital transformation is delivered is not just about technology or about data, but absolutely about the human element of that. So those of you who want to read a really high quality book around that space, totally recommend that to you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So just as we kind of round up this section, then we'll move into talking about what do we do? What practical action do we take? We just have another poll for you. So our second poll is around psychological safety. So it'd be really interesting to know what your own sense is around the impact of psychological safety on your organisation. Do you think that people feel safer at work? Do you think they feel about the same? Or do you think people feel less safe at work for any of the reasons that we've spoken about, or perhaps for other reasons that feel specific? So I wonder if we could just invite some views on that poll at the moment. Okay, thanks everybody. So that's really interesting. So that would seem to be very much in line with the kinds of trends that we're talking about. I saw some research recently, again from PwC, which said that last year and this year have been particularly noticeable. Okay, no, we've got a split on that. So 50-50 split, with some people feeling safer and some feeling less safe. No, settle down. Okay, so again, about 70% people feeling less safe at work. Yeah, so we saw from PwC some results from their chief executive survey that they do every year. 2018 was noticeable for a record rise in confidence, and 2019, so the very next year, was noticeable for a record drop in confidence. So we're seeing that kind of lack of safety going all the way through organisations at the moment. So in the moment, we'll move on and think about what it is that we can do. But Elizabeth's talked a little bit about having the right role models for leadership, and for leaders being a role model to help people move forward, particularly if they're feeling uncertain. That's my role model. So we've offered you a couple of options to read. There's also a great video that I'd recommend you watch. There's a 2-3 minute version. For those who don't know, that's David Bowie. For those who do know, you'll be able to tell just by the hairstyle that that's around 1999. The video that we'd suggest that you check in is linked to an interview by a British journalist called Jeremy Paxman, in which Bowie predicts exactly the impact that the internet is going to have in the most extraordinary way. So if you haven't seen it, really interesting to see what somebody who develops their visionary skills might be able to do. What for me is interesting in that story, and why he becomes a business role model, is not just that he had this fantastic capacity to look ahead and imagine, but about in practice what he did. So he did 3 things which I think are interesting in terms of leadership role modeling. The first is that he changed his own business model. So he recognized in 1999 that the music, the traditional music business model for performers was going to change. and that selling records, selling music was not going to be the way forward, but that touring was. And at that time, he had a newish marriage, he had a young child, and he didn't want to go out on the road. So he created the Bowie bond. So he went to the financial markets with a bond that was against future earnings on his back catalogue. And the bond was over a 10-year period of 10 years. It netted him $30 million, I think. Paid back absolutely 7% every year as promised, and then at the end of that 10-year period, the recordings reverted back to him. So he put himself in a very, very secure financial position. That enabled him to experiment. So he was responsible in 1999 for the first fully downloadable album. And then also in that year, he launched BowieNet, which was his own multimedia platform, and he co-created a song. So he co-created a song with a fan. So that sort of that sort of breakdown between the person who's perceived as the authority figure and the person who might be perceived as the audience broke down, and he was a forerunner of that. So that's one of our leadership role models, I guess. Elizabeth, there's somebody who's famous for being ambiguous, and we've talked a lot about some of the implications and ambiguities. What else do you see as the key changes in terms of how leaders need to respond?
I think that, I guess, first of all, Katrina, just to comment, yes, I agree that the person who made a comment in the chat box that actually that sense of job for life being completely a thing of the past and actually the need being for constant evolution, I agree with you completely. We also see the result that 70% of people in this conversation can see that there is less psychological safety at work. I think that's a direct result of the amount of ambiguity that people are experiencing. So for leaders in particular, there are a couple of things that are coming to the fore at the moment. One is the need for leaders to begin to understand what kinds of experiments and prototypes and testing can they run in their organizations? Where are the areas that are off limits for that? And how can they as individuals actually demonstrate experimentation in their organization? So one of the challenges for leaders faced with ambiguity is, what do we experiment with and what do we not experiment with? What are the risks of experimentation? And I think a second ambiguity is, who do we need to bring into the conversation in the organization? Because it's no longer the case that knowledge resides in predictable places in the organization. So if your organization has a structure or a means of communication where leaders are listening to the same people they've always listened to, they're listening to people according to hierarchy, they're listening to the known and predictable voices, or they're listening to the voices that they naturally gravitate towards, that's a risk. It's an operational risk. One of the key leadership behaviors that we're seeing as effective in this environment is the ability to seek out and listen to the voices that you don't want to listen to. So hearing not only the uncomfortable message, but actually hearing the countercultural message. Seek out and listen to the people in the organization, the stakeholders, the customers, the market voices who are saying what you don't want to hear, because they are often speaking about things that are coming down the pipeline and will prevent you falling into a difficulty by not reading the future quickly enough. So that's one, I think, ambiguity. I think the second ambiguity is around what makes leaders valuable. I mentioned earlier on that knowledge, expert, hierarchy, those no longer cut the mustard in terms of making leaders valuable. And it's very much more around their ability to create hubs and connections, to create a psychological environment which combines a sense of curiosity, a sense of community, and a sense of courage. And I think, again, I would really like to know in the chat box for you, what are the leadership qualities that your organization is putting at the forefront at the moment? What do you see as the leadership qualities that are carrying your organization through these ambiguous moments? Because this is not going to change back. So ambiguity is a normal way of life and has been for quite some time. I think probably the last ambiguity that I would mention, Katrina, is really the ambiguity between individual leaders and how they want to operate and the kind of leadership collective that organizations need to foster. So what kind of community do you need to build? And how do you reconcile that with the ambiguities that come from many different leaders with all their differences, trying in a very dynamic environment to create a future-ready organization? There are more layers of ambiguity, I think, than ever before: individual, collective, and organizational. And I think that's what I'm certainly seeing clients wrestle with at the moment: how they behave individually, but also what behaviors they are trying to put into the organization on a collective level, and indeed how they create structures, mechanisms, and ways of working, even to answer those questions. So what are the moments when they can talk about that in the organization?
Yeah, it's really interesting now to see some of those the characteristics that are coming up in the chat box.
Great things coming in there, right?
Michael, courage is the number one quality that I'm often hearing about in terms of what leadership looks like across organizations. Enterprise, absolutely. People thinking disruptively, and if that's not something that they've built their career on or they've built their expertise around, then being brave enough, and that links back to courage, I guess, being brave enough to surround themselves with the people, as Elizabeth said, who can ask those disruptive questions. And yes, absolutely, honesty. I think we're seeing a lot of conversations about the power of leaders being able to admit when they don't know the answer, but that so that in itself is admired. But the thing that is truly admired is then being able to ask the right questions, or creating space for the right questions to be asked, and really factoring in, okay, who do we need to bring together in order to solve this, rather than going into inertia, which I think are some of the dangers that we see, or just pretending, going into your room and trying to work out and pretend, and staying in that mindset where the leader must somehow know the answer.
I think there's also another risk that comes to mind when I see the quality written in there. I see courage written in there, sorry, which is the risk that somehow we try to make things simpler than they are, and that there is no headspace for leaders to ask themselves the question: what do I do when I just don't know what to do? How do I get all those variables? How do I look at them? How do I create a thinking space to understand the variables? And what elements of myself do I draw on when I don't know what to do? I also really love this comment that's come in now around innovative experimentation. In a culture of psychological safety, Francis, I couldn't put that better. I think the combination of creating a safe place and a spirit of adventure is absolutely the gold dust of leadership right now. Is that combination, the safety and the experiment. We sometimes describe that as the right balance between safety and stimulus. You know, where we have too much safety, we're not future ready. We're doing what we've always done with a little tweak. We're not being bold enough. If there's too much stimulus, people are just too frightened to really find their creativity. So I agree entirely there. It'll be interesting to think about in practice, what's that meaning in the conversations you're having with leaders at the moment about what they might actually do about this.
Yeah, they've been such fascinating conversations this year, and I think one of the dilemmas is something, Francis, that you've just expressed there in that comment around innovative experimentation in a culture of safety, because one of the things that makes people feel safe can also be a sense of structure, a sense of clarity, and a sense of understanding what's expected of them. So the art of being able to set up experimentation that has a boundary to it, where risk appetite has been discussed, where the emotional consequences of failure have been discussed. I've been involved in a piece of work recently myself where we decided that we'd work to minimum viable product as opposed to creating something that was perfect. And I experienced firsthand how vulnerable it can make you feel when you present something that's unfinished, something that's messy around the edges, something that you haven't had the chance to perfect, to a group of your peers who would expect who would generally be used to a different standard of work from you. So there's something really about working very explicitly on psychological safety around those innovative environments and understanding how you strike that balance. The danger is, of course, that the whole context that we're talking about and that we're working in becomes so fascinating that we almost lose sight of where the meaningful action is. Elizabeth, just to come back to your question, I think probably at the moment it looks as though there are four things that feel essential to be doing as a matter of urgency, and there's on a level, as in they're on the slide there. There's a level at which they're not brand new, but I think there are two things that are different about them. One is the way that we go about doing them. So it's the how, but also the level of urgency. So I think those four things: understanding the environment, expanding your mindset, making innovation essential, and connecting to your people, have been things that there's a danger that leaders have always meant to do, and you understand the environment once a year by going off to your retreat with post-its or even a groovy digital whiteboard, and you spend time understanding the environment, and you do that once a year, or you go on one training course a year to expand your mindset, or you have a couple of innovation workshops every quarter, and you go into a different space and you write lots of things up, and very few of them actually come to life. So I think one of the things that we're really noticing is those things that I heard them referred to recently as side of the desk issues. They're issues that need to be within the absolutely regular practice of leaders. So one of our experts was saying to me, what you see with leaders who are really getting this is that they really habitually spend time understanding their environment. They're constantly looking for new ideas. They're reading an awful lot. They're inviting people to send them things that they can read. They're very deliberately surrounding themselves with people who think differently than they do. They're going to see different things, and they make that an absolutely legitimate part of their day-to-day, week to week, and then they share that back with their teams, and they encourage input from the teams. So for example, you would see something like that at the top of a team meeting, not something that's a second thought. Expanding mindset is interesting. That's really about, I think, in practice, looking at how you reframe the value of leadership and becoming comfortable with that. So to come back to some of those qualities, guys, that you raised, honesty is really key in that you don't expect to be the expert, that you don't expect to be the authority figure, but that you're also asking really authentic, curious questions around how you can think about things differently. So I worked with a board recently of a very successful company, and we did some work on the network of inputs that they have from that board. So the network of people that they routinely work with and the network of inputs that they have in that board. And one of the things that they recognized was that whilst their networks were incredibly colorful, incredibly international, and incredibly creative, everybody who was in them thought the same way as that group of people did. So there was nobody there who was a really disruptive thinker. So the habitual question is, what are you doing each week? We see a lot of people who look after their well-being. Perhaps they're practicing mindfulness, or perhaps they're running or cycling or doing yoga to expand their fitness on a regular basis, but not necessarily doing that mindset work. So it's finding the tools or the individuals or the stimulus or the questions that help you to do that and making that regular. Making innovation essential is really interesting for me. So I was working with a group earlier this week who, when they looked at their strategy, recognized that 50% of their strategy was what they called trading. In other words, either taking care of what they were currently doing or improving it. And the second half was transformation. In other words, disrupting themselves and inventing what they call the future now and the future. So one of the things that we're seeing is that innovation needs to come into the day-to-day, and that might mean taking a look at some of the real fundamental things that you do and thinking about how you might reinvent them. And the how around innovation is really interesting for me, because if you look at all of the really good innovative practices from organizations, and this links back to what we were saying about psychological safety, the place that successful innovators start is with empathy and with complete focus on the human or humans who are going to be on the receiving end of that innovation. And I ran an innovation exercise with a group recently, and so they were using a tool in which empathy is a strong component. And one group of people who were non-expert were looking at the global mobilization strategy for the organization. And the head of global mobilization happened to be in the room. When he came over and saw what this group had done in 30 minutes, just starting from a process of real empathy, he looked at them and he said, "But you've solved it." He said, "I've had a team who've worked on this, grappling from their sort of existing mindset and not innovating for 6 months, and you've just broken it and put it back together within half an hour." So innovation doesn't have to take a long time, but it does have to be part of the regular heartbeat of teams. And then finally, and this is something that we touched on earlier, the need for a human level of connection is really interesting, and that can be very simple things like having videos on, as Elizabeth and I chose to do. We had a debate 5 minutes before we started about whether we wanted videos on, videos off. Really simple things like that, so you can see the face and hear the voice, as opposed to constantly messaging to teams, is really important. Asking questions around safety, around emotional well-being, acknowledging uncertainty, recognizing that people have some autonomy to deal with that and to come to you with solutions. All of those things can be really important. And one of the useful tools that we found is perhaps thinking about connecting to your people almost in campaign terms. So if somebody was going to run a successful campaign, they'd think about the different mediums that they had at their disposal. So how do I use my conference calls most effectively and most humanly? How do I use my team meeting? How do we use our WhatsApp group so that actually it's got some humanity in it and isn't just a whole set of messages, demands and confusion? Michael, thank you. Check-ins and check-outs in meetings, absolutely fantastic. So that moment at the beginning of a meeting where perhaps everybody checks in, and Michael, I don't know if you do it this way, but so you talk about what's on everybody's mind, what are you thinking about, how are you feeling? And you just hear that from individuals, everybody around the table or everybody on the call, without judgment and without trying to fix people. Have an actuary client who I introduced the process of check-in to, and 2 years later he still insists on doing that at every meeting before they get into the Excel spreadsheets. So that can be another great technique, but it's really thinking about those human ways that you can connect to people. And I guess I'd sum it up by thinking, on a regular basis, in those 4 areas, what can you practice? On a regular basis, what can you be trying? And the best questions are the what if questions. What if we ... So I think I'd encourage those 3 things probably.
And there's a couple of things I was going to add in as well, Katrina, around, again, for those people on the call who maybe are looking at this from the point of view of your whole organization as well as the leadership community, a couple of other things to think about. What my organizations need to be thinking about, or what are they thinking about, to create the right environment to thrive in this particular moment. And I think I would probably highlight 3 things from the work we're doing, from the research we're doing, and from what we're hearing from a wider range of organizations. And one of those is expanding and accelerating learning in the organization, which I mentioned earlier. The second one is creating innovation, and by which I mean creating a climate for innovation. And that, as you rightly said earlier, Francis, is a combination of experimentation and safety. And the third thing is a bit of a paradox, and that is creating space to focus on doing adaptive work. And what we mean by adaptive work is work where not only do you not know the answer, but you're not even necessarily sure that you understand the level of the question. So it's free space to say, what's the future doing? What might be happening? And how might we address this, given the skills we have, given the mindset that we have? And then a couple of other things I would really recommend it's worth thinking about. And they're about the culture of your organization. So it's kind of easy to think about innovation and talk about innovation, talk about leadership and talk about the digital age, as though it was somehow kind of easy to engage people with this. But one of the most important questions that you might be asking would be, what is the climate like in my organization right now? What's the appetite for taking a cultural risk? What's the appetite for actually being uncomfortable? And what do we need to put in place for our leadership communities to role model that it's actually okay to not know, and that it's okay to fail, and that it's okay to be exposed? And that's something that has to be done at an organizational level. And again, I've come across a really interesting example recently of an organization where the executive had a complete commitment to doing that, and it was clear that within that group, they wanted that to happen. They believed in the importance of doing that. And actually, in the wider leadership community, that wider community really believed, if we do this, we'll be blamed. There is not enough safety for us to take that risk. So the exec kind of believed it, wanted to do it, put the message out there. But because they hadn't actually invested anything in creating that feeling of safety in the community around them, that community simply didn't have enough courage. So we would really invite you, and especially again those people in the call who are senior HR professionals, senior business partner, heads of function for exec groups, really challenge yourselves around safety, risk, and blame, because it's incredibly easy to talk a good story, and it's incredibly hard to really create the courage and the conditions for people to be safe enough to try and to experiment. The faster the rate of change, the greater the human need to feel safe at some level. And the example I guess I would finish on there would be, I guess it's a bit like in a circus. If you're on a trapeze, you're going to jump off that trapeze. You have to know someone's going to catch you, whether it's the organization, whether it's a sense of clarity about the organization's purpose, whether it's a clear set of leadership behaviors, whether it's knowing that your executive themselves are jumping off the trapeze and taking the risk. If you don't know that, you are very unlikely to jump. And without those jumps in a very fast changing digital world, it's very hard to get enough imagination going in the organization. So I guess we wanted to invite you to think about not only your behavior as a leader, the behavior of your leadership community, but the context and the organizational culture within which you're operating. And again, please do share anything in the chat box you would like to about the link between the culture of your organization and what that's meaning for leading in a digital age. What's the connection between the world you're working in and your culture and how your leaders are actually operating? If there's anything you want to share there, that would be fantastic to hear it. Because we're going to move later towards another poll to find out a slightly bigger picture about where you're going next.
So let's have a look at that final poll now, and then we've got a couple of minutes left then just in case anybody had any questions. So our final poll, I guess our thought is that those four things are very important. I wonder what's the most important question for you now. How do we make time to understand future challenges? So that element of understanding the environment. How do we create the right mindsets to thrive now and in the future? How do we make innovation integral day to day? And how do we authentically engage our people? So I wonder if we could get some responses on that.
Oh, this is neck and neck at the moment. This is interesting.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? So it looks as if we have a balance between creating the right mindsets to thrive now and in the future. I mean, that's particularly challenging because it's one of the hardest things to measure, I guess, and a really interesting thing to think about rewarding, but also that authentic engagement of people coming through very strongly. So as has been the experience for us, looking at this subject matter this year, really that coming back to the human element, feeling incredibly important for people. Elizabeth, I think that covers pretty much everything that we wanted to speak about.
Okay. So there are just a couple of things I was going to throw in at the end, I guess.
Do you want to add? Yeah,
just a couple of things. One is just some open discussion and question space. So it would be really nice to hear if there's anything on your mind, what it is. That would be good to know. And also to say that we're going to share with you a link. So if you would like to download a copy of the white paper, you're very welcome to do that. And we'll make sure that you can have a link to do that. So if there's anything on your mind or either a question or a comment or a thought, great, throw it in the chat box. And then if you would be interested to read the research paper, please do download a copy of that. And I guess also to say it's been really a pleasure to have you with us, both the comments you've made in the chat box and just the fact that you're giving the space to yourself to think about the question of leading in a digital age and what it means for you. So it's been our pleasure to have you with us. If you're not with us, but you're listening to the recording, then it's our pleasure to have you with us in a virtual space as well.
So we've got a question on trading versus transformation, coming from Francis. So Francis, let me take a couple of minutes to do that. So trading would be the kind of so for example, if I perhaps use the example of this team, they've been given an extremely challenging set of numbers to deliver over the next 12 months. So that means that they have to be looking very closely at delivery excellence. They have to be looking at how this sort of existing machine is working, if you like, what improvements they can make, what they might restructure in the existing channel, how they might use resources and talents and budgets differently, to make sure that they can deliver business as usual, if you like. They've also got to think about, and they've been challenged as part of their strategy, to think about expanding their market, coming up with new products and new income streams, and thinking about themselves as an increasingly digital organization, because it's the kind of organization that, a little bit like retail, that they're a financial services organization. So they need to start looking at, for example, apps, and they have challenges like the neobanks coming into their environment. So that team now has to make sure that they're spending 50% of their time on business as usual and 50% of their time on thinking about how they disrupt, how they create new products, how they innovate, how they think differently, and how they create new income streams. And they need to lead people through that process. So I guess it's striking that balance and making sure that you don't let the urgent, noisy demands of trading eat into your transformation time, recognizing that, so on a very practical level, for example, what your team meeting needs to look like if you're covering both, because it's no point in your team meeting being 90% trading updates and a quick 10% on what have we learned this week. You need to pay much closer formal attention to your transformation as well as you do your trading. You need to reflect that in objectives, for example, that are set, and you need to think about what material targets you can put about transformation so that people take it as seriously as trading. So hopefully that helps a little bit more in terms of managing that tension. I think that's probably out of time in terms of questions. So again, thank you very much, everybody. Really good to be with you. And thank you also, as Elizabeth said, to anybody who's listening to us online.